These photographs, taken in June of 1952, show Californian police officers surveying the wreckage of a home explosion. The mystery blast, as the newspapers called it, was so violent that its shockwave shattered the windows of nearby houses. The origin of the explosion was traced to the home's laundry room, where an investigation uncovered chemicals that were so unstable that some had to be shielded from the camera flash before a photo could be taken. But the exact point of detonation was found to be an old coffee can, containing a powder called fulminate of mercury, a substance of such volatility that it needed only drop a few feet to the ground before igniting, which in turn ignited the many chemicals around it. The explosion would claim the life of one person, 37-year-old Jack Parsons, who is believed to have been the one who dropped the coffee can.
Who is Jack Parsons? Parsons was one of the rocketeers attached to Caltech in the 1930s and 40s. He was a brilliant chemist.
Jack was known in the rocket science community as an explosive specialist. He was described as possessing a self-taught knowledge of combustible chemicals, learned through bold and dangerous experimentation.
He basically was the fuels person that worked with a team of mostly graduate students at that point.
Throughout his career, Jack reconstructed a car bomb for prosecutors in an attempted murder trial, based on nothing but blown fragments of the original. And with little more than a high school degree, Jack solved problems in chemistry that led to some of the most important developments in jet propulsion.
How can you have a guy who knows the dangers of the materials with which he works drop it?
But as tragic as the irony of his death was, the case was closed only days after the accident, with Jack named both victim and culprit. But as Pasadena police were sifting through the wreckage, they found something that forever changed how Jack Parsons would be remembered. Inside his home, unharmed by the explosion, was a handcrafted wooden box. The symbols attached to the outside were unrecognizable to all but a select few, and the interwoven text was written in a centuries-old language said to be ancient celestial speech. Inside the box were years' worth of Jack's personal writings, with each page containing a clue as to who Jack really was and who he believed himself to be. The private life of one of America's first rocket scientists is something few understand today, but even fewer understood at the time of his death. But insights are found in exploring the beliefs and practices he dedicated himself to, in examining the private correspondence of his inner circle, who formed the secret society in which he belonged, and in Jack's own writing as he documented his ascent through their spiritual system. This is the story of Jack Parsons, or as he was called by some, Frater Balerion. In the days that followed Jack's accident, word of his death began to trickle through a fringe religious community that American media referred to as the Purple Cult. Its name usually accompanied descriptions of coffin-shaped altars and rituals performed by costumed citizens of Los Angeles, California. But the community itself preferred the name Thelemites, meaning adherents to the religion of Thelema, a word derived from the classical Greek for divine will. It was a belief system that had only been around for approximately 40 years, with its membership numbered in the dozens. It includes traditions such as specific prayers before meals, funeral customs, holidays celebrated to commemorate important dates, and a central holy book to which all believers adhere. While Los Angeles had been its nucleus for much of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, its believers were spread across the world, operating alone or in small groups, and communicating with one another by mail. Among the first to break the news of Jack's death was a Thelemite named Jane Wolfe, an actress living in Los Angeles who'd appeared in over 90 films throughout Hollywood's silent era. Jack was killed yesterday while experimenting with chemicals, Jane wrote. I will keep you informed if there is any further news. The letter's recipient was Carl Germer, a Holocaust survivor living in New York who'd been a Thelemite for nearly 30 years. I am deeply sorry, was his response. I had pinned great hopes on Jack, but I must confess I remained skeptical about his attainment, of his having crossed the abyss. Jack's tenure as a Thelemite is best described as complicated, with his approach to Thelemic practices leaving many of his peers puzzled. But from Jack's perspective, he had become the religion's new prophet, chosen to bring mankind under the law of Thelema. In his personal writings, Jack described his childhood as isolated. He grew up in the suburbs of Pasadena, California, estranged from his military father, and when writing of his relationship with his mother, he repeatedly used the phrase Oedipus complex. But Jack found comfort in what was, at the time, little more than a backyard hobby, the act of setting off projectiles with gunpowder and watching them slice through the sky. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure, I'm Roger Lanius. I'm a historian. I spent a career working in federal history programs, part of that time for the Air Force, a fair amount of it for NASA as the chief historian, and then the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum.
Can you describe the state of the field of rocket science prior to the 1940s?
Well, sure. Rocketry is being pursued literally around the world. There is a lot of people who are engaged in experimentation. Some of that experimentation is very simply amateur rocketeers who are out sort of, building rockets on evenings and weekends, and then they go out and launch them. Those are not necessarily very large. They don't necessarily fly very high, but this is a worldwide phenomenon.
Jack's passion for amateur rocketry would only deepen into early adulthood. And in 1935, he and childhood friend Ed Foreman found themselves searching for fellow enthusiasts in their hometown, at the California Institute of Technology. Neither Parsons nor Foreman were enrolled at Caltech, but their exuberance and hands-on experience earned them an introduction to a PhD candidate named Frank Molina, who was researching rocket propulsion for his graduate thesis. Frank Molina would later write his impression of the meeting. Parsons was a self-trained chemist who, although he lacked the discipline of a formal higher education, had an uninhibited and fruitful imagination. He loved poetry and the exotic aspects of life. Foreman, a skilled mechanic, had been working with Parsons for some time on powder rockets. They wished to build a liquid propellant rocket motor, but found that they lacked the adequate technical and financial resources. They hoped to find help at Caltech. They were sent to me, and then this story began. What were their goals as a group?
Mostly they wanted to explore space, and that's true for literally around the world, folks who were engaged in this. A lot of them had been brought up reading Jules Verne and H.G. Wells and these other science fiction writers, seeing movies that depicted this sort of thing, and they were excited by that.
Frank Molina's university connections granted them after-hours access to Caltech's Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratory, and they got to work right away. One of their early objectives was to break the rocket altitude record, which stood at 8,000 feet, set by their American contemporary, Robert Goddard. Jack had ideas he was eager to try, such as a concept he and Foreman called the machine gun rocket, named after its approach of firing a quick series of miniature gunpowder explosions, which would propel the projectile skyward one small burst at a time. They'd bragged to the newspapers that the machine gun rocket would nearly double Goddard's record, but they'd underestimated the engineering required to automatically reload the spent cartridges while the rocket was in flight.
The reality is that in the latter 1930s, when Molina and his colleagues were engaged in this activity, there wasn't a lot of knowledge that existed in the United States.
No one knew how to build a rocket motor, either liquid or solid, really, that was very effective or very satisfactory. So it meant that actually the people, those of us here, were really thrown upon our own resources.
When the trio tried to compare notes with Robert Goddard, who was testing rocket engines in Roswell, New Mexico, they found him secretive and unwilling to disclose the results of his private trials. But as their experiments at Caltech continued, they attracted more graduate students to join them, slowly expanding the group's range of skills. How did the members of the crew divide up duties in order to make the most of their individual talents?
It was pretty informal. They worked under the auspices mostly of Frank Molina, who had a lot of capabilities and was a truly good leader. Each of them had various areas that they focused on: propulsion, aerodynamics, electronics, control systems, and so forth. And they did all this sort of on an ad hoc basis. And they're building rockets. They're not very large. And they're building these things informally. It was all voluntary. They just did it because they were interested in it.
Jack was the group's chemist. Although he lacked the higher education of many of his colleagues, he brought practical experience from working at a local explosive powder company, combined with the knowledge from his own amateur experiments. And with the help of Caltech's facilities, Jack generated detailed reference charts of potential fuel sources, cataloging his search for the most effective combination of ingredients. Putting these mixtures to the test often resulted in spontaneous explosions and outbreaks of fire, but equally dangerous were the noxious fumes that the burning fuel would produce. In one botched experiment, the crew attached a small rocket motor to a pendulum in order to measure the force of its thrust. But this resulted in what Frank Molina described as a big cloud of this corrosive nitrogen tetroxide, which permeated the entire building and rusted all the metallic surfaces it encountered. How dangerous was their work?
Well, they had a nickname for themselves. They referred to themselves as the Suicide Squad.
The Suicide Squad was the beginning of a historical odyssey for Jack Parsons. It was also the start of an intensely personal journey, which headlines would later call Jack's double life. In 1938, Jack became a local celebrity after a team of prosecutors visited Caltech in search of an explosive specialist to testify in a car bombing trial. Following an inspection of the crime scene, 23-year-old Jack rebuilt the bomb, explained to the courtroom how the device operated, and reenacted the explosion. His testimony helped put 3 culprits in prison and introduced Jack to the public as an explosives expert. As his early career began to gain momentum, he found companionship with a woman named Helen Northrup, a private and rarely photographed person who was described by those who knew her as good-natured and intelligent. The two met at a Baptist church dance, and within a year, they were married. Despite the environment of their introduction, neither Jack nor Helen described themselves as particularly religious.
When we first went to Pasadena and lived there, we joined and I was baptized into the Baptist church, but it didn't mean anything to me. Unfortunately, I guess. Some of the doors I didn't open that I could have.
Jack's personal writing states that he developed a resistance to Christianity at a young age, due to his contempt for the crowd and unfortunate experiences with other children. But in his early adulthood, Jack discovered a curious book of religious essays on a friend's bookshelf. Its title was Conks on Pox, and it served as one of the earliest texts in developing the religion of Thelema, although its message was shrouded in allegory. The owner of the book considered it little more than an oddity, but would describe Jack's impression of it as real water to a thirsty man. Jack soon became captivated by its author, an enigmatic English occultist named Aleister Crowley.
And I believe in the serpent and the lion, mystery of mystery, in his name, Baphomet.
Jack learned that Aleister Crowley had a small group of followers only 10 miles from Pasadena, who operated a church out of the attic of a house in East Hollywood. Every Sunday, its members would conduct a public performance of a ritual that Crowley had written to encapsulate his philosophies, called the Gnostic Mass. At the time, this attic was the only place in the world where the Gnostic Mass was performed, and only a few photographs of these performances still exist. But over the past century, modern Thelemic churches have appeared across the country, and many of them have uploaded their own performances, using the same style of costume, temple furnishings, and script used in the original.
I believe in one secret and ineffable Lord, and in one star in the company of stars, of whose fire we are created, and to which we shall return, and in one Father of life, mystery of mystery, in his name, Chaos.
As incoming visitors, Jack and Helen would have likely been handed a copy of the script in order to play the part of the audience.
And I believe in one earth, the mother of us all, and in one womb, wherein all men are begotten, and wherein they shall rest. Mystery of mystery, in her name, Babylon.
The performance lasts around 40 minutes, and it opens with many Masonic gestures and ceremonial accoutrements whose meaning would be mysterious to first-time viewers like Jack and Helen. But as the Mass continues, it becomes sexually suggestive, and at the midway point, the priestess removes her costume entirely. At the close of the performance, audience members are invited to partake in communion, but rather than a sip of wine from a communal cup, attendees are asked to each drink an entire goblet themselves. The ingredients of the wafer of bread include blood, which could be from various sources. According to Aleister Crowley's writing, the best blood is of the moon monthly, then the fresh blood of a child or dropping from the host of heaven, then of enemies, then of the priest or the worshippers, last of some beast, no matter what. The blood is burnt to ash and mixed into the ingredients. A vegetarian substitute is often provided.
We ask that all present partake of a wafer of bread and a glass of either wine or grape juice. If you are not prepared to consume the Eucharist today, we thank you for coming and respectfully ask you to leave at this time.
After consuming the Eucharist, each attendee is asked to stand in front of the congregation and declare, "There is no part of me that is not of the gods." After the performance, the Parsons were introduced to the members of the church. Among them was film actress Jane Wolfe, dance instructor and priestess Regina Call, and gas company clerk Wilfred Smith, who served as the group's priest. The church had existed in Los Angeles for about 4 years, and its primary function was to operate as the American lodge of an international Masonic organization called the Ordo Templi Orientis, commonly abbreviated as the OTO.
Would you mind introducing yourself?
I'm David Shoemaker. I am a clinical psychologist in private practice in North Carolina. I've also been involved in Thelema and multiple organizations within that in the teaching and studying capacity for just about 30 years now.
David Shoemaker is one of the principal voices of modern Thelema. He holds a leadership position across the OTO temples throughout the United States, as well as provides training for many of the system's rituals and practices.
OTO is basically growing out of a structure that is loosely based on Freemasonry. And so the instructional method of OTO is primarily through its ritual initiations and study and practice of the principles that are inculcated through those.
The meaning behind the OTO's ritual performances are hidden in symbolism, making them inaccessible to outsiders. but the Order's manifesto offers this as its overall purpose. The aims of the OTO can only be understood fully by its highest initiates, but it may be said openly that it teaches Hermetic science or occult knowledge, the pure and holy magic of light, the secrets of mystic attainment, yoga of all forms, and all other branches of the secret wisdom of the ancients." End quote. While the origins of the order can be traced back to the European Freemasons of the late 1800s, after Aleister Crowley took leadership in the early 20th century, the OTO began to form its own identity as the first and only Masonic body to place the religion of Thelema at the center of its belief system.
It's also a socially oriented order, so there's explicit aims of social change, introducing Thelema into the world, more broadly into the culture, attempting to infuse Thelemic values, Thelemic principles in the culture itself, politics and social organizations and so on.
At the time of Jack and Helen's introduction, the religion of Thelema had yet to permeate American culture. What little was known by the general public was found in international tabloids, portraying a group of occultists who were guided by a single ominous declaration.
"Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love under will."
Those who attended the church were invited to take home copies of Aleister Crowley's writing in order to study the law of Thelema for themselves. The experience left a mixed first impression on the Parsons. In his autobiographical writing, Jack would describe alternating feelings of repulsion and attraction, which he ascribed to, quote, "a subconscious resistance against the ordeals ahead." While Jack was being introduced to the world of Thelema, the Suicide Squad was facing a crossroads. Throughout most of the 1930s, they'd been financing their research themselves, and using mostly secondhand parts found in junkyards to build their rockets. Jack and Ed Foreman had promoted their work in a couple of widely read science magazines, but what little funding they were able to generate from interested parties was spent replacing the laboratory equipment they damaged in their experiments. Without considerable patronage, the Suicide Squad were nearing their limits.
Halo, halo, tu Warszawa i wszystkie rozgłośnie Polskiego Radia. Dziś rano o godzinie 5:40 oddziały niemieckie przekroczyły granicę polską, łamiąc pakt o nieagresji. Bombardowano szereg miast. A więc wojna.
But as war broke out across Europe and the United States military readied itself for engagement, the country's scientific institutions were called upon for help. In the Northeast, the Aeronautical Department of MIT began work on a de-icing technology to keep windshields of military aircraft clear while passing through freezing altitudes. And the Suicide Squad were given a problem that only rockets could solve. Military pilots expected to encounter situations where adequate runway space was unavailable, and would need a way to boost their planes into the air in lieu of a traditional takeoff. Jack had imagined their work leading to breakthroughs in weather forecasting and interplanetary exploration. So when a budget of $10,000 was offered for the military contract, it was both a lifeline and a hijacking of their work.
The Caltech Rocketeers, the Suicide Squad, if you will, under Frank Molina's leadership, reluctantly went to work for the military. They did not want to do so, and there's some stunning letters by Frank Molina that he wrote to his parents when he started into this process, and he said, I just really hate building a weapon of war and furthering the possibility of hurting other individuals. But somebody's got to stop the Nazis. And if we don't step up, they're going to run roughshod over Europe and maybe into America.
The Suicide Squad sought advice from Caltech professor Theodore von Karman, who'd been mentoring the group since they'd begun their experiments in Caltech's aeronautical laboratory.
Von Karman was brilliant in all kinds of ways. He was a brilliant aerodynamicist. He was a superb teacher, and very much a leader in the sense that he could inspire people to pursue certain kinds of things that they wanted to do. And in fact, von Karman encourages this group, and they agree to do it, to accept a contract from the military.
And with the contract in place, the Rocketeers set up a base of operations in an open canyon of the Arroyo Seco in order to develop what they called jet-assisted takeoff, or JATO for short.
By the way, it wasn't a real jet, it was a rocket attached to an aircraft.
Despite the inaccuracy of the name, the word rocket was substituted, due to it still being associated with fantasy fiction novels and Sunday comic strips. Von Karman would later write in his memoir that their contract was nicknamed the Buck Rogers job.
These are retarding rockets. Make sure you put them in the lower racks with the firing end forward.
But the technological requirements were daunting. The rocket's thrust would need to lift an aircraft weighing several tons and maintain the thrust long enough for it to stabilize in the air. Such a rocket had never been built before, but according to Frank Molina and Professor von Karman, it was mathematically possible. The casual culture of their early experiments shifted into a more regimented approach as the squad divided into designated departments. Machine shop led by mechanic Ed Foreman. Computations conducted by mathematicians Barbara and Richard Canwright. Liquid propulsion led by PhD candidate Martin Summerfield. And fuels led by Jack.
Parsons was a very fine chemist. He had studied chemistry and he had worked as an individual who was interested in developing the most effective fuels that were out there. These were essentially solid fuels at this point in time.
Jack's initial approach would be to design a custom black powder by combining his own ratio of charcoal and sulfur, mixed with oxidizers and binders to form a solid fuel sludge. This sludge would be packed directly into the rocket's chamber, and when ignited, it would provide a slow, controlled burn that would give pilots access to takeoff fields otherwise impossible. As the squad began making progress, more funding would be granted, but a full demonstration of the rockets at work would soon be required. Jack and other members of the squad were given security clearance and ordered not to disclose their work with anyone. And as war spread across Europe, the squad labored in secret. The performance of the Gnostic Mass was never far from Jack's mind, and over time he began to immerse himself in the philosophy, history, and purpose of Thelema through the writing of its enigmatic prophet. To his followers around the world, he was called such titles as Baphomet and the Master Therion. But to the wider public, he was an Englishman named Aleister Crowley, and his name began appearing in the press around the turn of the 20th century. As an avid mountaineer, he gained attention from journalists for his expeditions to some of the world's tallest and most dangerous peaks, where members of his climbing group didn't always come back alive. His poetry also garnered public recognition, both for its lyricism and frequently provocative subject matter, with many critics predicting a promising literary career ahead of him. However, mainstream opinion of Aleister Crowley began to shift in 1909, when he debuted a book series titled The Equinox. While the series would include much of Crowley's literary output, the book's stated purpose was to offer suitable candidates initiation into a training academy. Its members, hidden among society and practicing in secret, were students of what Crowley would call magic, the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. The book series served as a repository for the school's curriculum, guided meditations to develop the students' astral body, and rituals for invoking the gods of ancient mythology were encountered at various grade levels, alongside methods for training the mind and body to safely perform them. Tuition would be free aside from the price of the books, but admission would be limited to those who could pass an introductory written exam, demonstrating adequate knowledge of astrology, the Kabbalah, and comparative Eastern religions, among other topics. Successful applicants would be paired with a student of a higher grade to act as their instructor, and welcomed into the Brotherhood of the AA.
The AA is designed to be a one-to-one training organization where each student has a single teacher and generally doesn't know who else is in the order. It's very private and the work is mostly solitary. There are no group meetings or any sort of social intercourse like that, except for a very few initiatory ceremonies in the early grades. The idea in AA is that at every stage you are being taught by someone who has done the work before you, that is at least one grade ahead of you. So in order to advance, you have to do a certain set of practices and document it diligently in a magical diary that is then submitted and reviewed to your superior. And it's a training and testing organization. You simply don't advance until you have shown that you have the capacity to pass certain tests. And some of these are ritual competence. Some of them have to do with meditative results. Some of the training has to do with memorization of magical correspondences, such as planets and gods and incenses and such that are associated together, with certain Kabbalistic principles.
Student progress would be measured by advancement along a skill tree, with each grade representing attainment in one or more of the school's magical disciplines, culminating in the ultimate attainment, realization of the student's divine purpose, what Crowley called the true will. Students of exceptional promise had artistic work such as poetry and musical compositions featured in the book series. The impetus for Crowley's formation of the AA was a short 3-chapter book written 5 years prior to the Equinox's debut and serving as the governing law to which his school of magic would adhere.
Who is the author of the Book of the Law?
Well, I'll defer to what Crowley said about it, which is that the book was dictated to him as if he were hearing a voice over his shoulder, and that the entity supposedly dictating to him is named Aiwass. So in sort of modern parlance, this would be what we might call a channeled writing. He didn't use that term, but that's the idea, that this is a book dictated to him by his spiritual contacts. Of course, in the mundane world where a book has to have an author, it's attributed to Crowley.
The text begins, "Had the manifestation of Nuit, the unveiling of the company of heaven, every man and every woman is a star."
What does "every number is infinite, there is no difference" mean to you?
In asking about particular words, phrases, sentences, passages from the holy books, including the Book of the Law, I'm going to follow what is a fairly common approach in modern Thelemites, which is not to offer interpretations. What we want, and what Crowley wanted, is for each person to approach, especially the Book of the Law, on its own terms.
The book's overall purpose was to proclaim what it called the Law of Thelema, a law whose tenets are codified in a single sentence.
What is your favorite passage in the Book of the Law?
A boring but true answer, do what thou wilt from the whole of the law, because everything stems from one's understanding of the nature of the true will as a principle, and the nature of the true will in oneself. Anything else is secondary. Everything else has to follow from that. Every tool, every practice that we train and test on is designed to open up awareness of our true will. To have that one sentence in that central holy book of the Book of the Law, I don't think I'm overstating it to say that's all we need in many senses.
Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. In his personal writing, Jack would interpret the verse as a call to express his total self on all planes of being and experience. And in February of 1941, roughly 2 years after attending their first Gnostic Mass, Records show that Jack and Helen Parsons had officially been initiated into both the magical school of the AA and the Thelemic Masonic Order of the OTO, taking the Law of Thelema as their new religious ideology.
Внимание, слушайте, говорит Москва.
Товарищи, гитлеровским войскам удалось захватить Литву, значительную часть Латвии, западную часть Белоруссии, часть Западной Украины. Над нашей Родиной нависла серьезная опасность.
The war in Europe was escalating, with many crucial battles taking place in the air. Reports also surfaced that the Nazis were developing their own jet-assisted takeoff, although how far along they were in development was unclear. The Suicide Squad was growing in size and sophistication as more accommodations to their base in the Arroyo Seco were constructed. And slowly, a working rocket that could assist military pilots in battle began to form. While Martin Summerfield was making auspicious progress with liquid fuels, Jack's experiments in solid fuels had already produced a working prototype. The design was simple. Once the solid fuel was packed into the rocket, an igniter was activated via a small electric charge. As the fuel burned, the combustion would travel through a hollow chamber and exit through a nozzle, providing thrust. The rocket would need to burn for at least 10 seconds, enough time for a plane to stabilize in the air before the fuel depleted. A solid fuel rocket that burned longer than a few seconds was unheard of, but Jack's years of amateur experimentation and knowledge of explosive materials had prepared him for this responsibility. As he set to work, photographs show him often dressed in a full suit, with colleagues noting sweat dripping from his pores as he labored in the hot desert. And after countless hours, Jack developed a black powder-based fuel capable of providing nearly 30 pounds of thrust for an astonishing 12 seconds. As per their military contract requirements, the squad installed a rack of prototypes onto a small test plane and conducted their first official demonstration of jet-assisted takeoff. These tests, conducted in August of 1941, were the first instances of an American plane using rockets to achieve liftoff. Two planes filmed side by side, one equipped with JATOs and the other without, illustrate the reduction in takeoff time. Further testing showed that the rockets provided an abrupt mid-air boost if ignited post-liftoff. Although the demonstration was cause for celebration, there was a fundamental problem with Jack's black powder fuel. When ignited, nearly a third of these rockets would spontaneously explode, ripping a hole in the plane and endangering the life of the pilot. After an investigation, Jack discovered that the issue lay in the fuel's shelf life. When left to sit overnight, the fuel supply would develop cracks, and once the burn pattern reached a crack in the fuel, the rocket became a bomb. Jack began mixing in various binders such as stationary glue in order to give adhesion to the fuel, and compress the mixture into the rocket an inch at a time for added density. But the prognosis was grim. The only way to safely use these rockets was to ignite them within hours after the fuel was poured, rendering them impractical for military application.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
By the time the United States had entered the war, Jack had been a Thelemite for nearly a year, attempting to advance in both orders of the AA and the OTO.
How does one advance within the OTO?
In the OTO, advancement is based on several factors. First of all, to gain entry into OTO, but then with each successive degree, you need sponsors from the degree you're applying to. So 2 people of that degree who agree that you are a worthy candidate. And then often there's a particular period of time you need to spend in a certain degree before advancing to the next, and then, paying the dues to advance to the next degree, or the fees.
The inclusion of Jack had been cause for optimism, as members wrote to Crowley to brag of the intellect, enthusiasm, and striking appearance of their new recruit, citing Jack as a valuable asset to the order. With Crowley's blessing, Jack advanced quickly through the early degrees, with the order's closely guarded magical secrets on his horizon. His time thus far in the AA had been spent at the introductory grade of probationer, where he would obtain a ceremonial robe to wear during his magical practices, and begin a new daily routine that would signal his transformation into a Thelemic magician. 4 times per day, he would perform a short ritual adoration to the sun called Libra Resh, and twice per day, he would perform the lesser ritual of the pentagram, in which a series of connected star patterns are drawn and visualized in the air around himself, before summoning the 4 archangels who rule over the elements of air, water, fire, and earth.
Having a simple ritual, like the classic lesser ritual of the pentagram, practiced chronically for months, years, decades, in my case, we've gained the ability to invoke force in a few minutes or less, or banish force equally quickly, in a way that we could not have imagined until we had practiced a simple ritual like that for a long time.
According to the AA's syllabus, the probationer grade would require Jack to spend at least 1 year experimenting with any magical practices featured in the Equinox series that seemed relevant to him at the time, while documenting the results in a diary to be evaluated by his instructor. While the portion of Jack's magical diary covering his probationer grade has been lost to time, his later writings mention invocations to the Greek god Pan and the Egyptian god Horus as among his first major magical workings. Jack explains his approach to these operations in the following way, quote, "In invocation, as in any other scientific procedure, the essential requirements are the knowledge of the operation, the quality of the equipment, and a painstaking attention to detail. An invocation is a means of tuning in on that which is desired, and tuning out all that which is superfluous or antagonistic to the operation," end quote. In Thelemic magic, a ritual to invoke a particular force consists of creating a multi-sensory experience, in which a place of working is filled with sights, smells, and tastes that are said to be associated with the force in question. Compendiums of spirits, both angelic and demonic, are issued to AA magicians alongside charts of corresponding sensory inputs, which Aleister Crowley claimed to have collated from various religious traditions throughout history, giving students everything they need to construct their rituals. Jack explains, quote, "The symbols, talismans, weapons, and names selected are those which correspond to the particular power invoked, so that the entire work is actually a focusing operation. In this sense, it is proper to say that the ritual acts upon the magician, tuning his being to a particular idea. The magician, in turn, reacts upon the universe, bringing this idea into materialization by virtue of his own power," end quote. The operation typically ends with a scrying session, where the magician quiets their mind to await a vision or some form of communication. Each spiritual force is said to provide unique insights to the magician who conjures them, but the tangible nature of these spirits is often the subject of debate. In an essay titled "The Initiated Interpretation of Ceremonial Magic," Aleister Crowley wrote that these conjurable spirits were merely parts of the brain.
Is ritual magic best interpreted as the act of willing forth certain aspects of oneself or an interaction with an external hidden reality.
When Crowley wrote that, he was in what he would later admit was a fairly materialist phase, materialist in the philosophical sense of conceptions of what would normally be called spiritual entities as being merely parts of the brain. And you will get competent and intelligent and effective magicians who argue that that's exactly what's happening. It's simply a way of optimizing and particularizing and targeting certain aspects of our consciousness and working with them. And others will argue just as strongly that these are actual external spiritual entities, and it's definitely not just part of the brain. I think there's plenty of room for both to be true, actually.
In the summer of 1942, on the 53rd variation of the solid fuel that would power the JATO rocket, Jack Parsons made a discovery that forever changed the field of rocket science. He discarded black powder altogether as a fuel source, and instead substituted a new mixture consisting of two main ingredients, roofing tar and the oxidizer potassium perchlorate.
It's at this point that Parsons makes a leap of insight that is basically revolutionary. No one had thought of this before. No one had seen this.
Carefully heated into liquid form, this mixture was poured rather than packed into the rocket, where it cooled into a perfectly solid brick that burned more evenly, powerfully, and reliably than any the squad had tested before, with what appeared to be an indefinite shelf life. Theories have been put forth as to how Jack came up with the idea, such as seeing roofers applying the substance in one of Pasadena's developing suburbs. But his true source of inspiration remains the subject of speculation.
Jet-assisted takeoff. Depending on the type of plane, a reduction in takeoff run of 33 to 58%, not to mention a definite increase in the rate of climb. With the igniter in place, the unit is now ready for attachment to the plane. A very simple job.
Set flaps full down. Assist takeoff power switch on. Check to be sure that there's no one between the rockets and the tail, and throttle up to normal takeoff manifold pressure and RPM. Pull the trigger and hold it down, holding fast with your brakes. Keep the trigger down till you feel the thrust of the rockets. When you're clear, pull the release and drop the units. They're expendable once they've done their job.
With jet-assisted takeoff now battlefield ready, the Rocketeers began mass-producing the units, and soon newspapers across the country were reporting that the U.S. Navy was using them in the war.
If you needed a short field and you needed to get up in the air in a hurry, you could put this JATO on the side of the aircraft and get the aircraft to move faster, more quickly, get into the air. This was great for short field takeoffs.
Not only was the takeoff time nearly cut in half, but planes could now carry additional cargo, with the extra weight offset by the rockets. Headlines were calling jet-assisted takeoff America's new weapon against the Axis powers.
From the very beginning, remember, JATO is an explosive device. If a JATO unit drops more than 12 inches or is roughly handled, put it in segregated storage and report it immediately to responsible authority.
The Suicide Squad materialized into a proper company, taking the name Aerojet. Solid-fueled JATOs were their flagship product, and as long as the war continued, business was nearly guaranteed. To commemorate, Jack purchased a 10-bedroom, 8-bathroom mansion located in a Pasadena suburb called Millionaires Row. And it was here, in the house that would become infamously nicknamed the Parsonage, that both Jack's magical and professional lives took an unexpected turn. The mansion was located at 1003 South Orange Grove Avenue, and was known by the citizens of Pasadena as home to millionaire and lumber operator Arthur Fleming. Fleming was beloved in Pasadena for donating much of his land and wealth in order to transform Caltech into the prestigious university it had become. After passing away inside the mansion, Fleming was given a solemn send-off in the local press, and his home and furnishings were auctioned. But after Jack Parsons took ownership, the atmosphere changed. The OTO temple was moved from the attic in East Hollywood to the mansion's upper story, with several fellow Thelemites moving into the home's many spare bedrooms and adjacent buildings. Newspaper advertisements offering evening courses in magic and occult philosophy directed incoming visitors to the Fleming Mansion, where weekly productions of the Gnostic Mass were now performed in more lavish surroundings.
And I believe in one Gnostic and Catholic Church of light, life, love, and liberty, the word of whose law is the Lema.
During Jack's first year in the mansion, police records show local complaints of nude pregnant women jumping through a bonfire in the front yard, in what appeared to be a religious ceremony. Another neighbor was on record calling the mansion, quote, a gathering place of perverts. As the Second World War entered its fourth year, jet-assisted takeoff was growing in prominence as the Germans made a battlefield debut of their own version of the technology. The Navy soon increased their order to 20,000 JATO units per month, and Jack's new company, Aerojet, expanded into additional locations across California to meet the growing demand.
That was a contract that they did for the War Department. Proved to be very successful, ultimately led with other contracts that followed to the creation of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in 1943.
This is the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, America's first and one of the world's foremost rocket research centers.
In response to Germany's development of the long-range V-1 ballistic missile, an official rocket research division was opened at Caltech. Development of a diverse range of offensive rocket weapons were among the lab's early wartime objectives, alongside continued improvement of Jack's revolutionary solid fuel propellant in order to power them.
Improved solid propellants have resulted from blending additives to the fuel and oxidizer. After curing, rubber-like samples of each batch of propellant compounded is tested for significant physical properties. But proof of success comes only with firing.
Jack's oath to the AA obliged him to openly proclaim his connection with the Lema and to speak of its principles to those around him. But Aleister Crowley's system of spiritual attainment through ritual magic didn't appeal to the majority of JPL's scientists. I knew that he was involved in magic, Frank Molina would later recall, but I never made any effort to enter into those kinds of things. I was always suspicious of mysticism. However, there were several colleagues at JPL who joined Jack in pursuit of their true will. Mathematicians Barbara and Richard Canwright appear in the OTO registration, with Barbara serving as occasional church secretary. Rocket mechanic and childhood friend Ed Foreman also joined. Out of the 4 designated departments that launched the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, 3 were led by Thelemites. In his memoir, Dr. von Karman would write the following recollection of his colleagues' religious practices. The members met in a room with walls of carved leather. The membership was sworn to obey the law. There is no law beyond do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. In practice, this was translated among other things into sex rituals, which I learned about when the FBI questioned me about Parsons. The FBI's investigation into Jack Parsons began in 1943, when special agents arrived at the mansion to question the nature of his church. Jack explained that the Lema was dedicated to the spiritual advancement and improvement of self, and to the freedom and liberty of the individual. A search of the mansion revealed a large portrait of Aleister Crowley hung prominently at the top of the main staircase, and numerous Crowley-authored books found throughout the home's bookshelves and nightstands. And despite the fact that most of the residents had never met Crowley in person, agents found stacks of letters exchanged between them and Crowley himself. The name Aleister Crowley was well known to American authorities. His reputation had been tarnished by tabloid stories of drug-induced orgies, followers being branded with heated daggers, and rituals in which neighborhood animals were sacrificed, all supposedly occurring among himself and his students of magic, earning him the title, the wickedest man in the world. As the FBI continued their inquiry into the Church of Thelema, they uncovered what they described as a free love cult, with members engaging in open sexual relationships with one another. The Parsons had both been conducting affairs with fellow members, and Jack was quickly developing a reputation at the Jet Propulsion Lab for propositioning many of its female employees. Various passages in the Book of the Law reinforce this culture of sexual freedom as a means of exploring one's true will, with the concept of sin defined as that which restricts the will. But Jack began to push the limits of his new lifestyle when he began an affair with Helen's younger sister, Sarah Betty Northrup, who'd been initiated into the OTO only months after the Parsons themselves. Although his wife had been supportive of an open marriage for religious reasons, this affair had crossed a personal boundary. Residents of the mansion reported arguments between the two of them that could be heard throughout the house. Jack would describe this broken boundary as his, quote, magical confirmation in the law of Thelema. The FBI concluded their search of the mansion without taking immediate legal action, but they'd written in their report that Crowley's doctrine of do what thou wilt sought to tear down everything democracy stood for, and preach that whatever one desired to do was the proper thing to do.
Probably the most common misunderstanding, it's really pervasive, and those who are just at the fringes, the misunderstanding that do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law refers to sort of just doing what you feel like. So it tends to be taken as kind of sinister, like there's no rules, you just do whatever you want, it'll be anarchy and everyone will be murdering people if they feel like it. It's actually the opposite of do whatever you want. It's the idea that there is a true will inherent in each human being, and this is their basic nature. This is their way of being.
When asked why a man of his professional standing would be attracted to such a belief system, Jack replied simply, "It fulfills my religious needs." As Jack continued his private magical work in the AA, his course of study grew more intense with each grade. At the third grade of Zelator, an examination required him to hold specific poses with a bowl of water balanced atop his head for an hour's duration, with a single drop spilled constituting a failing grade. Jack would also encounter a test of personal limitations, where he would be asked to determine how long he could go without eating or drinking, how long he could go without sleep, and how much alcohol he could consume.
In your opinion, what's the value of discovering these personal limits?
Well, first of all, no one should do anything at the expense of their overall health or well-being. The point is, know thyself. In order to know oneself, we need to know what our limits are, know what our strengths and weaknesses are, know what our basic capacities are. How can we know what changes are possible or what changes have occurred unless we test those? We indulge in our daily meditative and ritual practices as experiments, much like a behavioral scientist would, except in a more subjective way. Observing these limits and experiences and results is a big part of working in the system.
But in early 1943, Jack received a letter from Crowley suggesting that it was time for him to undertake one of the AA's most controversial rites of passage, a practice called Liber Iugorum. Found in issue 4 of the Equinox, Liber Iugorum would begin after Jack had chosen a common word such as and or the, and committed to go a full week without speaking it. And for each instance the word is accidentally uttered, Jack is instructed to, quote, "Cut thyself sharply upon the wrist or forearm with a razor, even as thou shouldest beat a disobedient dog." Accompanying these instructions are 2 photographs which depict a student of Crowley's with several cuts across their arms, with each cut meant to serve as both a punishment and a tally for evaluation. Crowley's caption below the photographs read, "Not nearly good enough to pass." Diaries of student magicians show them cutting as many as 58 times per week before acceptable levels of cognitive control were achieved.
So in his day, behavioral psychology had not gotten very far. So the idea that the most effective way to stop doing something is to punish ourselves was the thought of the day, but we know much more about how behavior can be conditioned at this point. The idea of positively reinforcing things as opposed to punishing, but also even within the realm of punishment, there are less destructive ways to track our work with something like Liber Euchorum, such as we could snap our wrist with a rubber band that we were wearing or something like that, that has the same sort of non-destructive pain effect. And then we can go to a little diary and record how many times we slipped up and said the word we were trying not to or whatever.
Crowley's insistence that Jack undertake such an extreme practice was to give him a sense of mental independence from his AA instructor, with whom he was developing an unhealthy attachment. The man responsible for guiding Jack through the grades of the AA was the Church of Thelima's head priest, Wilfred Smith. Having been a Thelemite since 1916, Smith boasted of attaining the highest grades in both systems of the AA and the OTO. But to Jack's shock, Crowley's letters served to warn him that Smith was, in fact, a fraud, who had performed no magical work beyond the AA's early grades. "I think he was passed to neophyte," Crowley wrote, "but he certainly never went further. Where are his records? What has he accomplished?" Having served as the Church of Thelima's head priest since 1933, Smith had failed to establish a consistent congregation, and church records typically showed fewer than 10 members in attendance for temple meetings. Thelemic literature such as the Book of the Law and other tracts expounding the concept of true will were well circulated around the Los Angeles area. But Crowley's concern was that those wishing to investigate the system further would inevitably encounter the underwhelming Smith as the local spokesperson of Thelema. Quote, "The fact is that you simply cannot wear a robe. You have no dignity. It is not your fault that you are of small stature, and that you never seem to know quite what to do with your hands. But when anyone has these qualities, either they take the most extravagant measures to get over the handicap, or they are careful to avoid pushing the facts in people's faces." End quote. Other members suggested that it was Smith's personal conduct that was deterring potential converts.
Wilfred Smith was, as I said to Jane once, he had a dirty aura. But he did work very hard on keeping the OTO going or trying to get it started. And we only had a very few people from time to time. And then Wilfred would make sexual advances to some woman who didn't care about it, and the whole family would disappear after that.
In the fall of 1943, a letter arrived at the mansion. It was an urgent message from Aleister Crowley regarding the true will of Wilfred Smith. Upon analyzing Smith's horoscope alongside his ability to inspire loyalty from church members despite possessing no attractive or virtuous qualities, Crowley had arrived at a startling conclusion. Smith was not a man at all, but the incarnation of some god. Smith was ordered to depart the mansion at once and begin the process of divine realization at a fellow member's nearby turkey farm, free from distractions. Every other member of the order was banned from speaking to him under the threat of expulsion, and on the advice of other members, Crowley appointed Jack to replace him as the new head of the church. As Jack climbed higher within the ranks of Thelema, his status in the world of rocketry would suffer proportionally.
Parsons and Foreman at Aerojet were seen as being somewhat disruptive in the organization.
The culture of Aerojet and JPL was shifting as the war effort began to rely more heavily on the two fledgling rocket companies. Unorthodox and dangerous work practices mixed with a questionable religious influence on colleagues resulted in Parsons and Foreman being viewed as liabilities. And in 1944, two of the company's founders were presented with a persuasive argument to sell their original shares.
When the war is over, rockets are going to fade. There's going to be a wartime need for JATO units anymore. They have no post-war application. Parsons and Foreman listened to that argument, and for the $250 investment that they had made initially, each were given $50,000 4 years later.
At only 30 years old, in what should have been the beginning of a promising career, Jack left the world of professional rocketry he had helped to establish.
This is London calling. Here is a news flash. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead. I repeat that. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead.
By mid-1945, the Second World War was coming to an end with the assurance of an Allied victory. Despite what Jack had been told, rocketry would continue to grow in prominence, and the post-war projects taken by Frank Molina and the remaining members of the Suicide Squad were more in line with the group's original vision. They'd begun development on a new rocket called the WAC Corporal, which would soar to over 200,000 feet, shattering the altitude record and achieving a dream the squad had envisioned nearly a decade prior. But having been alienated from the field, Jack found himself turning to alternative means of personal and financial stability. Inside the pages of the Pasadena Star-News, he posted the following advertisement: rooms for rent limited to bohemians, poets, artists, students, between 21 and 30, no bourgeois, Christians, or vulgarians. Although outside the specified age range, one of the new residents of the mansion would be a charismatic 34-year-old naval lieutenant named Lafayette Ron Hubbard. At the time, military records show Hubbard on a convalescent leave from the Navy, and he'd come to the mansion adorned in military pins and medals, telling stories of valor from his service in the war. Hubbard had achieved minor celebrity status as a fiction author, whose work appeared frequently in popular fantasy magazines with over 150 publications to his name. His list of accomplishments also included membership in the Explorers Club, with Hubbard boasting of many globe-trotting adventures which inspired the exotic settings in his stories.
I've slept with bandits in Mongolia, and I've hunted with pygmies in the Philippines, and my conclusions were that man, regardless of his state of culture, was essentially the same. He was a spiritual being, and he was a spiritual being that was pulled down to the material, the fleshly interests, to an interplay in life that was, in fact, too great for him to confront. And I concluded finally that he needed a hand.
Not long after Hubbard moved into the mansion, Jack wrote Aleister Crowley to inform him of the new tenant. He is a gentleman, red hair, green eyes, honest and intelligent, and we have become great friends. Although he has no formal training in magic, he has an extraordinary amount of experience and understanding in the field. From some of his experiences, I deduce he is in direct touch with some higher intelligence, possibly his guardian angel. Biographical accounts of their introduction state that the two likely met at a local convention of science fiction writers, where Jack was known to frequent as an avid fan of the genre, and where Hubbard, one of the group's most prolific authors, had established a reputation as a hypnotist.
Ron Hubbard came to our club, and he hypnotized all of the members except me. I wanted to read remain in present time and watch what was going on. And I remember it was fascinating. He told one boy that he had a little kangaroo in the palm of his hands, and the boy was going all around showing everybody his little kangaroo that was hopping around.
He is the most thelemic person I have ever met and is in complete accord with our own principles. Their friendship formed at an opportune time for Jack, as his promotion to the head of the Los Angeles Church of Thelema granted him access to some of the OTO's most closely guarded secrets, those which fell into the category of sexual magic. According to OTO instructions, this type of magic would combine sensations of erotic ecstasy with the intense focus and will that Jack had cultivated through years of magical training, allowing him to invoke a higher class of spiritual entities. Although there is no official record of Hubbard joining either the OTO or the AA, by January of 1946, Jack judged his new housemate to be thelemic enough to include him in what would become his most advanced magical project to date. Per thelemic tradition, Jack kept a detailed diary of the experiment, which includes the following introduction. This book contains the record of a magical experiment relating to the invocation of an elemental, and thereafter of the goddess or force called Babylon, and the results thereof. The content should be clear enough to those who are prepared for understanding, and a little study and effort should make it so for those who desire understanding. For the rest, each will no doubt interpret it in accord with his own predilections.
Would you mind introducing yourself?
Certainly. My name's Peter Gray. I'm an occultist, a magician, and writer, and I run an occult publishing company called Scarlet Inbreed.
Peter has written extensively on Jack's advanced magical workings, as well as gathered his own ritual experience on the subject.
How long have you been a practitioner of magic?
I've been practicing magic my entire adult life, so I've been a magician for probably at least 30 years now.
As Jack's diary states, his operation would commence in two unique phases, with the first consisting of the invocation of what is known as an elemental.
What is an elemental?
So the idea of the elemental comes from the 16th century work of Paracelsus and came down through the magical tradition. An elemental is a creature of fire, a creature of water, a creature of air, or a creature of earth. An elemental of water, for example, an undine, you would think of a mermaid. An elemental of earth, you would think of a gnome.
The elemental Jack intended to summon would be from the element of air, also known as a sylph. For his purposes, this entity would serve as a sexual partner for the second phase of his operation. At the time this project began, his wife Helen had left the mansion to join their excommunicated leader at the turkey farm. The two would go on to have a son together named Jack Parsons Smith. And Jack's sister-in-law, Betty, had begun to prefer the company of their new housemate. Correspondence between church members attests that Betty and Hubbard would often display their newfound physical connection in front of Jack, causing him to constantly rein in his jealousy in order to focus on the experiment. Although Betty and I are still friendly, Jack reported to Crowley, she has transferred her sexual affections to Hubbard. I cared for her rather deeply, but I have no desire to control her emotions. And I can, I hope, control my own. I need a magical partner. I have many experiments in mind.
So elementals are in a mixed status between gods and men. So they're seen in folklore as having bodies. When Jack is talking about an elemental, he's talking about an individual who has a particular quality that makes them more than human or other than human.
According to Jack's diary, his ritual for summoning an elemental would employ a type of magic dating back to the 16th century, designed by Dr. John Dee, court astrologer to Queen Elizabeth I. It involved a language known as Enochian speech, which, when spoken, would allow the magician to communicate with the angelic beings governing the elements. The process of putting this magic into practice was complex, as Jack's diary reveals a procedure consisting of 11 individual rituals. It would begin with the construction of an Enochian table, upon which the operation would take place, along with various magical instruments specifically prepared for the occasion. And once his place of working was constructed, Jack would place himself in an altered state of consciousness by chanting an Enochian invocation to the elements.
So Enochian, as an angelic and a magical language, has an extremely powerful psychic and mental effect on the practitioner when it's performed correctly.
The names of the invocable companions are found within the quadrants of an Enochian chart, which Jack would copy by hand onto virgin parchment. According to OTO instructions, as many as 4 companions could be summoned, 1 from each of the elements, and assigned working hours for each throughout the day. But for Jack's purposes, he needed only 1, and he chose an entity named Rizla from the element of air. To summon it, Jack would need to chant the Enochian names of the governing spirits presiding over it, methodically working his way down the hierarchy until arriving at the name of his target elemental. The final and most important step of the process, in accordance with the OTO's technique of sexual magic, would be for Jack to place his own substance, euphemistically called the marrow of the wand, onto the letters of his elemental's name. Jack's diary shows a repetition of this working for several consecutive days, although the element of air seemed to have manifested in the form of a violent windstorm. No elemental presented itself. I have been extremely careful and conscientious in this ritual, lending all my will and scientific training to its precision and preparation. Yet nothing seems to have happened. The windstorm is very interesting, but that's not what I asked for. After invocation, Hubbard would read the psychic energy of the room, with Jack identifying him in his diary as the operation's seer and scribe.
In the majority of ritual magic, there are several professionals who are engaged in a conjuration. So for Jack to be using Hubbard as a seer and scribe is not unusual. So rather like tango or a boxing match, it depends on the chemistry between the participants. And Jack and Hubbard certainly had a chemistry.
The scribe developed some sort of astral vision, Jack recorded, noting that Hubbard seemed to have detected the problem. The lingering energy of Wilfred Smith was present in the room, preventing progress. Ron, who has never seen Smith, described him behind me, clad in a black robe and having an evil, pasty face. He attacked this figure and pinned it to the door with 4 throwing knives, with which he is expert.
The real crucial difference for the magician is everyone's intent, is everyone's will focused on the same outcome? And with Hubbard, that was certainly the case.
And on the 14th night of the operation, a young woman appeared at the mansion's doorstep. I seem to have my elemental, Jack wrote to Crowley. She turned up one night after the conclusion of the operation and has been with me since. She has red hair and green eyes as specified. The woman who Jack believed to be his elemental was 24-year-old Marjorie Cameron. And like Jack, she had assisted in the American war effort, serving as a cartographer for the women's division of the Navy.
Not many civilians know it, but a large number of Navy jobs are now open to women, except those listed as primarily seagoing billets and those which require considerable physical strength.
After the war, she received an honorable discharge and relocated to Los Angeles, finding work as a fashion magazine illustrator. According to her, she had met Jack while accompanying a group of friends to a party at the mansion, where the two formed an immediate romantic connection. But from Jack's perspective, Marjorie had been sent to fulfill a key role in the second phase of his operation, the invocation of the goddess Babylon. Originally appearing in the Book of Revelation, Babylon is prophesied as a harbinger of the apocalypse, and is described as a harlot riding atop a 7-headed beast, holding a golden chalice filled with the filth of her fornication.
Babylon appears in Revelation 17, and she's a figure of imperial Rome and sexual excess, and she's framed in an entirely negative fashion. When she reaches Thelema through the revelations of D. Crowley and Parsons, she undergoes a significant change. She's not read as a symbol of utter evil. She's viewed as a symbol of female liberation, completely recontextualized in a new era which has moved beyond the Christian understanding of the book.
Crowley described her as the mother of abominations, the bride of chaos that rideth upon our Lord the Beast. References to the apocalyptic characters in Revelation are found throughout Thelema, with Crowley himself named in the Book of the Law as holding the office of the Beast 666, a title which he would adopt as the signature for much of his correspondence. Magicians in the AA who reach the grade of Philosophus are assigned a daily invocation to Babylon by performing a ritual called the Mark of the Beast. Similar to the lesser ritual of the pentagram, star patterns are drawn and visualized in the air around the magician, only now drawing them upside down before concentrating their will upon tracing the invoking hexagram of the beast.
What is an invocation to Babylon meant to accomplish?
Rather than the smaller demons that you'd be using to achieve small ends for you, Babylon has an eschatological context. So an invocation of Babylon is designed to bring forward the apocalypse. It's an unveiling, an unfolding, a bringing into flesh, and a transformation of the destiny of the world.
According to OTO instructions, high-level magicians such as Jack were to invoke the goddess carnally, aiming their will and lust toward her image in a series of prolonged adorations. But now, armed with his elemental, Jack would heighten the invocation by using a partner.
The difference here technically is between Jack performing 7th degree work, a work of masturbation, or performing a 9th degree work, which is a working performed with a partner. The difference would be for Jack in the Babylon working, that Marjorie wasn't trained in magic. So he was working with someone who had no idea of what he was doing.
OTO instructions regarding this type of working recommend that the magician's sexual partner be kept ignorant of their true purpose, so as to not interfere with the will of the operation.
So Jack would have been engaged in a process of visualization, mantra, and working with her without giving her too much information about what was going on.
Marjorie would express her side of the relationship with Jack through her artwork. After nearly 6 weeks of nightly invocation, Jack recorded in his diary that Babylon had finally revealed herself. 77 verses of text were supposedly dictated from the voice of the goddess, which Jack was commanded to transcribe. The text announced itself as the 4th chapter of the Book of the Law, heralding a new lineage of Thelema, with Jack as its prophet.
When she delivers the book to him, she tells him to publish the secrets of the OTO, which is a breaking of all the possible oaths. So Jack, although he's trying to follow in the footsteps of Crowley by describing the Book of Babylon as the 4th book in following the 3 books of the Book of the Law, he's breaking the fundamental script of the prophet, and he's allowing us to enter into a new future.
The document states that Jack's invocations were successful, and the goddess's physical incarnation upon humanity would appear in 9 months, suggesting that Jack had prompted her conception, perhaps even with Marjorie herself. Within the text were instructions for a new ritual in which Jack would communicate directly with Babylon, and he wasted no time constructing a place of working, putting the newly received book at the center of the altar. Hubbard would resume his role as the operations seer, but this time his role was more crucial. Jack would invoke the goddess and Hubbard would speak on her behalf.
So normally, if someone is functioning as a seer, then one would expect either a second person to be taking down the notes, functioning as the scribe, or the magician would be doing so. So Hubbard appears to be engaged in some form of automatic writing, with Jack providing him with prompts.
But the prophecy that Hubbard relayed was foreboding. Babylon's incarnation would be contingent upon Jack becoming, quote, living flame. She is the flame of life, power of darkness. She destroys with a glance. She may take thy soul. She feeds upon the death of men. Beautiful, horrible. One mysterious portion of the prophecy Jack chose not to transcribe. On March 6th, he wrote the following to Crowley. I have had the most important, devastating experience of my life between February 2nd and March 4th. I believe it was the result of the 9th degree working with the girl who answered my elemental summons. I have been in direct touch with the one who is most holy and beautiful mentioned in the Book of the Law. Instructions were received through Ron the Seer. I am to act as instructor, guardian, guide for 9 months. Then it will be loosed on the world. I cannot tell you the depth of reality, the poignancy, terror, and beauty I have known. I have found my will. It is to serve, and serve I shall. All I am or will is pledged. Jack was to remain completely undistracted from his devotion to Babylon until the time of her arrival, or the incarnation would be in danger of failure. But only weeks after the conclusion of the operation, he was presented with a unique business proposition. The demand for sailing yachts in California was high, but the supply was low. And Hubbard, being a master seaman, had devised a way for Jack to take advantage of this opportunity. With a bit of upfront capital, Hubbard and Betty would travel from Pasadena to Miami, purchase 3 yachts where they were in high supply, hire a team to sail them back to California via the Panama Canal, and sell them for a profit. Their partnership would be called Allied Enterprises, and when the final arrangements were made, Hubbard had supplied about $1,200 of seed money, but Jack's contribution was nearly $21,000, which amounts to over $340,000 in today's currency. Although Jack likely had some money left from the sale of his Aerojet shares, biographical accounts attest that most of his money came from selling the mansion, with Jack moving into a small carriage house down the street. He expected this temporary sacrifice to be more than compensated for by their resulting profits, but in the meantime, he had effectively closed the only operating OTO temple. A feature in the Miami Daily News showed Hubbard and Betty having arrived in Miami, as they prepared their newly acquired sailing vessels for what Hubbard described as an indefinite voyage. According to an official request sent to the U.S. naval offices, Hubbard did not intend to take the boats back to Pasadena, but to sail to South America and China for the purpose of collecting writing material. When news of the business venture reached Aleister Crowley, he sent an urgent telegram to Los Angeles, declaring Jack the victim of a confidence trick. Records kept by the Miami courthouse show that Parsons attempted to correct his misjudgment by following Betty and Hubbard to Florida to issue a restraining order, preventing them from leaving the jurisdiction with the boats. But upon his arrival, Hubbard and Betty fled by sailing into the Atlantic Ocean. Hubbard attempted to escape me by sailing at 5 p.m., and I performed a full invocation to Bartzabel within the circle at 8 p.m. At the same time, his ship was struck by a sudden squall off the coast, which ripped off his sails and forced him back to port, where I took the boat into custody. However, I am afraid that most of the money has already been dissipated. I will be lucky to salvage $3,000 to $5,000. In the interim, I am flat broke. Not long after returning to Pasadena, Jack watched from his small carriage house as his former mansion was demolished to make room for an apartment complex. In December of 1947, headlines around the world announced the death of Aleister Crowley at the age of 72, following a long struggle with bronchitis and opiate addiction. Although Jack and Crowley never had the opportunity to meet in person, their frequent correspondence demonstrates a close paternal bond, with Jack addressing his mentor as beloved father and signing off as thy son. But at the end of his life, Crowley's final statement regarding Jack was one of disappointment. About Jack Parsons, all I can say is that I am sorry. He was led astray firstly by Smith, then by a confidence man named Hubbard. He is just a weak-minded fool and must go to the devil in his own way. As the 1940s neared its end, Jack's misfortune was only beginning.
Communism in reality is not a political party. It is a way of life, an evil and malignant way of life. It reveals a condition akin to disease that spreads like an epidemic. And like an epidemic, a quarantine is necessary to keep it from infecting this nation.
Members of the Caltech Rocketeers who had helped secure an Allied victory in the war were coming under suspicion for un-American activities. Within Caltech had been a club of communists, led by a Russian-born physicist named Sidney Weinbaum, who'd been known to recruit graduate students to join the American Communist Party. An FBI investigation revealed that Frank Molina, the leader of the Caltech Rocketeers, had joined the party under a pseudonym.
He had some left-leaning political tendencies, as a lot of intellectuals did in the 1930s. This is not an uncommon thing. As people looked at the Great Depression and saw that the economic system, capitalism, that the Americans had embraced didn't seem to be doing all that well at that point in time. And what are the alternatives? And he, like Robert Oppenheimer, and I could name any number of other intellectuals of that era, sort of flirted with Marxism. Flirtation is all that it was, but nonetheless, it did, in the aftermath of World War II, lead to Molina getting caught up in the Red Scare, losing his security clearance.
Other members of the original Suicide Squad who'd attended these meetings were also stripped of their security clearance and removed from the jet propulsion lab they had helped to create. Parsons admitted to the FBI that he'd previously attended meetings of the Sidney Weinbaum Club out of intellectual curiosity. But the Bureau's investigation into Jack's political past would ultimately seize upon a different, controversial ideology. Among his colleagues at Caltech, Jack was discovered to have been circulating a single-page political thesis authored by Aleister Crowley, which bore the title Liber Oz.
Liber Oz is a concise statement of what Crowley believed to be the rights of human beings. It's inherently assertive and even aggressive about those rights. Not saying these are the things that you should go out and do, but these are the things that a human can go out and claim as one of the rights. Someone's going to get into trouble about Liber Oz. It's usually that there is a clause in there that says man has the right to kill those who would thwart these rights, referring to the previously listed rights like freedom of movement and freedom of thought and speech and things that we tend to all agree on are important. When signing on to or circulating a document like this publicly, there is a risk that someone says, wait, man has the right to kill those who thwart these rights? Is this person threatening us? That's not the point of this document. It's the equivalent, in my view, of Martin Luther putting his theses on the door of a church and saying, here's what I believe is true.
Jack's FBI file states that he had been working in high security roles for American aircraft companies in the years following his expulsion from JPL and Aerojet. But having been labeled subversive, Jack wrote that his security clearance had been revoked and his career in jeopardy. In September of 1948, I was suspended from all my activities on charges which include activity in the OTO and the circulation of Liber Oz. Jack's personal life was equally fraught with failure. He had dissolved his first marriage with Helen so that he could marry Marjorie Cameron. But correspondence shows that the two would often go months without seeing each other, as Marjorie pursued her art career in various cities across the U.S. Although she had become pregnant during the Babylon working, biographies state that she terminated the pregnancy while away from Jack on a trip to New York. The 9-month window for Babylon's incarnation had passed with no evidence of her arrival. By autumn of 1948, Jack's scientific contribution to the growing field of rocketry had been disregarded, as he found himself barred from government work and employed as a filling attendant at a local gas station. He was 34 years old. He wrote that he'd arrived at a choice between 3 alternatives: madness, suicide, and something Thelemites call crossing the abyss.
The concept of the abyss in Crowley's system is that there is this abyss between everyday human consciousness and superconsciousness.
Typically reserved for advanced students who have reached the AA's 8th grade of exempt adept, the abyss is considered one of the final steps a magician can take to achieve full realization of the true will. It would be the culmination of 10 years of magical training and represent Jack's highest form of devotion to the goddess Babylon.
Through the series of spiritual exercises which Crowley sets out in Thelema, individual initiates climb the tree of life until they reach the abyss, which is guarded by Babylon, and through submitting to her and emptying every last drop of their blood into her chalice, they cross the abyss, having transcended duality and become magusses. With his crossing of the abyss, he was seeking a revelation and the authority and direction for the next stage of his life work and the wider destiny of mankind.
The abyss is often cited as the curriculum's most dangerous phase, due to the vulnerable mental state the magician places themselves in upon entering. Some sources indicate the journey through the abyss involves invoking the 4 princes of hell, with the magician asserting their own willpower as the superior cosmic force. But according to Thelemic lore, the real danger of the abyss lies in the oath the magician swears upon entering.
The oath of the abyss, to paraphrase it, is a swearing that you will take everything that happens as a direct communication of the divine with your soul. That means everything. So the usual interpretation is that at that point you commit yourself to be stark raving paranoid. Everything you notice is somebody telling you something. The warning is that you can go crazy from taking this oath.
Jack's diary claims that on Halloween of 1948, he retreated to the Mojave Desert and remained there in solitude for 40 days.
Certainly the crossing of the abyss is a significant spiritual endeavor which can provoke symptoms which look very much like psychosis. It's a very fragile and a dangerous state, which is why outside of the magical traditions, we have people on spiritual paths retreating to monasteries to be gently taken through these difficult processes.
After his return, he wrote that he had taken the oath and entered the abyss. At present, I have entered magical regions where there is no possibility of outside help or assistance. The oaths are taken, the bridges burned, and there is no possibility of turning back. If you hear of any of my future experiments, be assured that I am acting in accordance with my true will.
We have the idea of a bridge across the chasm. Now that is an old mystic idea that there was a chasm. There was a chasm between this existence, where we are now, and a higher plateau of existence. And that many people trying to make it fell into the abyss. Well, we've built a bridge, and the bridge goes from this state of existence to that state of existence. And the bridge is all complete now, and it can be walked.
Although Jack would never see L. Ron Hubbard in person again, his activities in the ensuing years were well known to the public.
Yes, I had been able to handle some human beings in such a way as to produce a new state of being.
Hubbard had introduced his own method for achieving higher states of consciousness. He called it Dianetics. It didn't involve ritual magic, but instead focused on eliminating engrams, traumatic memories that lurk inside the cells of the body, causing sickness and psychological impairments.
We are victimized in this society by many of these engrams. There are certain standard ones that run through the society.
Hubbard claimed to have discovered a new type of auditing therapy, which puts the subject into a hypnotic trance and transforms their mind by identifying these engrams and exhausting their power.
When I count from 1 to 5, the first words of the engram will flash into your mind. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Can't relax.
Go it again.
You 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 can't relax.
Hubbard claimed auditing sessions could raise a person's IQ by as many as 26 points, as well as cure nearly any illness, including poor eyesight. Many journalists began accusing him of orchestrating a hoax or a scam. Several medical professionals called Hubbard's version of hypnotherapy potentially dangerous to a person's psyche. But Dianetics only rose in popularity. Advertisements for auditing sessions soon populated newspapers across the country. Training workshops were established to teach applicants to audit their own patients. And within its first year of operation, Dianetics had made over $1 million in revenue. Headlines were calling it the fastest growing movement in America.
This plan has been worked out for quite a long period of time. It's been very successful, and these states are attainable, and they walk forward.
Hubbard claimed his system offered the only safe passage into the realm of superconsciousness, and those who attempted to cross by any other means were doomed to fall into the abyss below.
That's the bridge. That's the abyss.
Jack's own journey through the abyss was having a unique effect on his psychological state, as evidenced in his writing. He produced 2 revealing documents during this time, both written upon swearing the oath. The first took the form of a manifesto, with Jack embracing his role as the prophet of Babylon and vowing to rally humanity for the coming apocalypse.
His intention in crossing the abyss was that he would become a Magister Templi, a master of the temple, and would be able to shoulder the authority for the unfolding of the new eon and the overthrow of Christianity, with the establishment of the law of Thelema and his role as Crowley's successor recognized in the world.
Quote, I, Belerion, Antichrist in the year 1949 of the rule of the Black Brotherhood called Christianity, do make my manifesto to all men, an end to the pretense and lying hypocrisy of Christianity, an end to the slave morality, an end to prudery and shame, an end to restriction and inhibition, for I, the Antichrist, am come among you, preaching the word of the beast 666, which is, there is no law beyond do what thou wilt.
So the Antichrist in Revelation is very much a propagandist who is speaking on behalf of the beast, and Jack is placing himself in that position as the voice of Thelema, as the philosophy of freedom.
Jack's second document was written only days after the first. It was written from the perspective of Jack's superconsciousness, informing its material vehicle that it was taking control. The document takes an inventory of Jack's life from childhood to the present day, interpreting each major event, from his failed marriage to the loss of his fortune at the hands of Hubbard, as necessary steps on his journey to this moment, in which he becomes an agent of his higher self. A new set of rules for Jack's life going forward was established. It would include limiting his magical working and focusing instead on becoming a professional, productive, and conscientious individual. Its final directive reads, pay no attention to any phenomena whatsoever, and continue in a sober and responsible way of life under all circumstances.
In the document, you can see the best of Jack, the clarity and the discipline that he brings to scientific illuminism being applied to every aspect of his life.
Everything is dead now except the body and the will, Jack wrote of his progress through the abyss. and it is my will that the body survive to do that will. By mid-1949, Jack successfully argued the loss of his security clearance in a closed court, reinstating his access to classified material. Newspaper reports show that he obtained a permit to start his own explosives facility, called Parsons Chemical Manufacturing. Side work was found in the special effects departments of film studios, building what is known as squibs, small explosive devices worn under an actor's costume to simulate a gunshot.
He's very much a self-directed, a rational, and a purposive individual who's aiming towards a successful crossing of the abyss.
Jack's ambition was to re-enter the field of rocketry, but the landscape had shifted since the end of the war.
The German rocket team under Wernher von Braun is brought to the U.S. The Caltech Rocketeers and the German Rocketeers worked together for a short period of time at White Sands.
In the face of ongoing political investigations, and slowly being replaced by their wartime enemies, many of Jack's former colleagues would leave the United States altogether, beginning with their leader, Frank Molina.
Ultimately, he leaves rocketry altogether, moves to Paris, and becomes an artist. He had a long, successful career as an artist after that, and was even the founder of a major art journal called Leonardo, which is still existing today.
The prospect of leaving the United States in search of better opportunities also appealed to Jack, and in 1950, he was offered the opportunity to relocate to the new state of Israel as part of their developing rocket program.
So what we see from Jack's life is that he completed his writing. He was setting out on a new chapter of his life, taking a trip to Mexico with Cameron to see if they could save their marriage, and also planning on taking ultimately a job in Israel.
But Jack's career would never get its second wind. During his application to the Israeli rocket program, he submitted copies of his own research that had been labeled classified. His own secretary notified the FBI, and Jack's security clearance was again revoked, and an investigation into possible espionage was opened. As he entered the final period of his life, correspondent shows his thoughts returning to the Babylon prophecy. I have suffered some vicious astral attacks lately, and my scryings indicate that they relate to a fruition of one aspect of the Babylon working. It is now 4 years since I saw the words of destiny in blood and fire, and transcribed my own disaster. One of the last pieces of writing he ever produced was a letter to fellow Thelemite Carl Germer, which didn't arrive until after Jack's death. He mentions experiencing manic hysteria, depressing melancholy, social ostracism, economic collapse, and mental dissociation, before concluding with this perplexing final paragraph. Now I'm off to the wilds of Mexico for a period, also in pursuit of the elusive holy guardian angel, before winding up in the guardroom finally via the booby hatch, the graveyard, or... If the end, you can tell all the little practicuses that I wouldn't have missed it for anything. Signing off as no one. The explosion occurred in late afternoon of July 17, 1952. A roommate discovered Jack lying beneath an old washtub, clinging to life, with his right arm blown off and the skin of his cheeks burned away to reveal his teeth. An ambulance rushed him to the hospital, but he was pronounced dead only minutes after arriving, with his cause of death recorded as multiple injuries of his entire body. The police investigation revealed that the accident occurred while Jack was attempting to complete a last-minute order for the special effects department of a film studio. With his laboratory equipment packed for Mexico, he attempted to mix the explosive in an old coffee can. The can slipped from his grasp and ignited as it crashed to the floor. Headlines reporting the event referred to it as a double tragedy, as Jack's mother ingested a bottle of sleeping pills moments after hearing of her son's fate. Marjorie Cameron was photographed arriving on the scene hours later. and the following morning, the story appeared on the front page of the Los Angeles Times. In the years following Jack's death, Marjorie Cameron would embrace her role in Jack's magical working, playing the character of Babylon in a film by fellow Thelemite Kenneth Anger. Her paintings, displayed across the Los Angeles art scene, would be one of the few remnants of Thelemic ideology in the ensuing decades.
These things we know in Dianetics. We know, in short, the bug that gets into the machine. We can troubleshoot the machine.
L. Ron Hubbard's Dianetics would change its name to the Church of Scientology and continue along its trajectory of becoming one of the most popular fringe religions in the world.
You know, Scientology occupies the most space on this earth of practically anything. We're in countries that haven't even heard of Christianity.
In 1969, the Sunday Times released an expose covering Hubbard's involvement in Jack's Babylon working, the details of which were not previously known to members of Scientology. 2 months later, the Sunday Times printed Scientology's official response, which claimed that their founder participated in Jack's magical operation for the purpose of infiltrating and disbanding the OTO and putting an end to their savage and bestial rites. Quote, Hubbard's mission was successful far beyond anyone's expectations. The house was torn down. Hubbard rescued a girl they were using. The black magic group was dispersed and destroyed and has never recovered.
By the time of the mid-60s or so, Thelema had come into the mainstream a bit through the work of people like Timothy Leary, with Crowley showing up on the Sgt. Pepper album cover and things like that. It was sort of there in the fringes of awareness. But in terms of Thelemic organizations, things had dwindled to almost nothing. Phyllis was one of the few people from the old days who was still, initiating and working with students and really keeping it alive through publications. So starting in the late 60s, early 70s, he was working with her husband at the time, Grady McMurtry, and others who were surviving members from the Thelemic groups of the 40s and 50s who were still living, and started initiating again. That's when OTO was essentially restarted. AA had always been going under Phyllis, but certainly started to build in terms of bringing in new students.
Frictions within the community would cause the AA to splinter into several different branches, with some still operating on a strict tuition-free policy. Legitimacy of each branch is often determined by a student-teacher lineage that traces back to Crowley, with David Shoemaker's AA and Temple of the Silver Star meeting such criteria.
It's been my focus for the past 15 years as the head of it, and continuing to try to evolve that with the help of some wonderful people has been largely my life's work in that period of time.
But many members of the new lineage of Thelema would look back on Jack's magical working as little more than a cautionary tale.
We've all heard the Babylon story about Jack Parsons, I'm sure. I was in the same house for 3 months with Jack starting some stuff. That place was horrible. I used to try and go up there and clear it out with a banshee ritual, but I was no match for what Jack had got going around. Evocation can be extremely dangerous if you cannot control yourself, and Jack could not control himself.
Jack had very much turned away from Crowley's order and was trying to go in his own direction. So the official OTO line is a recognition of Jack as part of magical history, but a complete failure to accept the terms of the Book of Babylon as somehow being the fourth book of the law.
Do you consider Liber 49 to be canonical?
I consider it to be valuable in its own terms, but I don't consider it canonical as fourth chapter of the Book of the Law or anything like that. And I've never talked with anyone in my 30 years who did believe that this was canonical fourth chapter of the Book of the Law. So that's a no.
The American OTO's official website keeps a running list of distinguished individuals who have contributed to the development of Thelema throughout its history. Of the 21 names listed, Jack Parsons is not among them. JATO in its original form can still be seen in action at aviation shows around the country, mostly for its aesthetic value. But the most common use of modern-day jet-assisted takeoff is seen during the launch stage of spaceflight missions. True to their original design, they are filled with solid fuel and attached to the vehicle's sides, where their unique explosive power boosts the spacecraft to its desired altitude. Like their ancestors, they are jettisoned once they've served their brief but critical purpose.
Solid rocket booster separation confirmed. Guidance now converging.
At the same time that the Caltech Rocketeers had quite significant success early on, they are not remembered. Not in the same way that the Wernher von Braun rocket team of German engineers who came to the United States at the end of World War II. They were famously the developers of the V-2 rocket, the first ballistic missile, and they became famous in the aftermath of World War II as the Germans who helped Americans get to the moon. That's an overstatement for the success of the von Braun team, but for all of their pop culture resonance, the Caltech Frank Molina rocket team is almost unknown, and it should be on a par in my mind.
The Jet Propulsion Laboratory that the Caltech Rocketeers founded would go on to become one of the country's leading scientific institutions and help to bring the United States into the space age. Jack would not live long enough to see his dream of space exploration realized, but following the U.S. moon landing, his scientific contribution was recognized with a 25-mile-wide impact crater on the moon's dark side being given the name Parsons.
Parsons has probably gotten the credit he deserves. He has perhaps gotten a little more scrutiny than he might have otherwise because of his background in the occult. But be that as it may, his contributions in the development of early rockets out of the Caltech community was significant.
As many reflect on the legacy of Jack Parsons, one lingering question remains. At the critical moment of transporting a container of explosives, and knowing full well that dropping it would mean his death, what caused his grip to loosen?
Jack was observed throughout his life as working with explosives in an extremely haphazard fashion, so Occam's razor suggests that it was indeed a terrible accident.
The investigation into his death revealed that sometime before the explosion, Jack had been carelessly disposing of volatile chemicals in his laboratory trash can, a habit which a colleague compared to a highly trained surgeon operating with dirty hands.
He was probably murdered by the United States government. Either that or he died in an accident, depending on whose story you believe.
Murder theories are entertained by many to this day. Culprits range from the FBI to a man named Earl Kennett, who Jack had provided expert witness testimony against in the Los Angeles car bombing trial 14 years earlier. News reports show that Kennett had been released from prison less than 2 months prior. But no evidence was ever found to suggest that anyone other than Jack was involved.
My position is that in the practice of magic, there is really no such thing as a natural death. So there are a couple of things that I see going on from a magical perspective. One is that Hubbard planted what could be seen as some quite deep suggestions in the Babylon working, predicting Jack's death. Flame is our lady, flame is her hair, I am flame. Thou shalt become living flame before she incarnates. So I think Jack's death was a magical death, and I think his martyrdom was necessary, and it's one of the reasons that we're still talking about him today.
The simplest theory of the accident came from the person who arguably knew him best.
Ed Foreman says he thinks it was a warm day, Parsons' hands were sweaty, it slipped. He probably watched the fulminate of mercury drop to the floor and watched it in its slow descent and knew exactly what he was in for.
Mr. Crowley, what went on in your head?
I'd like to thank my 3 interview participants, Roger Lanius, David Shoemaker, and Peter Gray, whose unique perspectives helped bring this story to life. I don't take sponsorships very often, but I'm proud to be working with this video's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News helps me to research perceptively by providing key context behind each news source's bias, factuality, and ownership of the outlet, allowing me to come to my own conclusions. When looking into the technological advancements of modern rocketry, I can see that this particular topic has over 100 sources reporting on the story. And by clicking these tabs here, I can easily compare how the language differs from where the news outlet falls on the political spectrum, illustrating how I can't rely on a single source to get the full picture. The app and website are easy to navigate. I use Ground News to stay cognizant of how consuming news can affect my overall perspective. The Nobel Peace Center called Ground News an excellent way to stay informed, avoid echo chambers, and expand your worldview. Ground News is fully independent and subscriber funded, and by going to groundnews.com/atrocity guide, you can get 40% off unlimited access with a Vantage subscription, which is the plan that I use. Subscribe today by scanning this QR code or by clicking the link in the description below. And thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this video.
Mr. Crow.